My story is short, but the time it covers involves several long years. I can't exactly tell you just how desperate I am to find peace over my experience. Finding somebody that will listen without judgment has been a tremendous struggle, and no small part of my frustration. The other part is knowing the sort of evils that run free and the things they do to innocent people that just happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I utterly hate confined spaces, and I think that's one of the reasons my older cousin took every chance she could get to get me into a cave with her. It was always a cave, or a closet, or a tunnel, or some small space that we weren't really supposed to be in. She loved to go exploring, and she loved to scare me to death in the process. She was like that as a child, and she stayed that way as she grew older. One day, she finally picked the worst possible place to explore, and she just had to get me involved. She said that she saw a shadow enter a cave in the deserts of New Mexico. We're natives to New Mexico, so the desert doesn't really faze me as much as caverns do. Most of the time, I could hold my breath and explore with her for just a few moments, but that eerie little story was an automatic no for me. Telling her no only made her try harder to persuade me. I don't know how she did it, but she sold me on going into that cave for 5 whole minutes. She said I could set the alarm on my phone if it would help. However, I foolishly agreed. The cave entrance was wide and tall, as was the first chamber we found ourselves in. It was more spacious than I thought, and this lulled me into a false sense of security. A natural tunnel led on, and we went, and I agreed to go, feeling more calm than I should have. We both lit up the flashlights on our phones, and I instantly regretted it. There were skins stretched on the tunnel walls, and symbols painted onto them in some sort of chalky red substance. There was no airflow, but I definitely remember seeing the slightest movement in those same skins, as if by some diabolical means there was still some life in them. They didn't just sway, they were twitching and jerking. I pointed this out to my cousin, but she wouldn't even look. She was far too busy worrying about where the tunnel went next. I was beginning to panic well before the 5 minutes were up. The cavern felt inhabited by something wrong, and if the first tunnel had evil-looking skin that still moved, the rest of the cavern couldn't have anything good. She got too far ahead of me, and I lost her. She traveled well beyond my phone's light. She yelled at me to pick up the pace, but I couldn't. Fear held me back like a lanyard. Suddenly, she was running towards me, but 2 very large gray hands with long and dirty nails closed around her face from behind her. One of the fingernails dug into her eyes, and she screamed as she dragged backwards. That pushed me over the edge. Everything that happened after that felt like a bad movie that I was watching from back of the theater. One of my legs wanted to run after her. One wanted to run to the cave entrance. It was complete mental agony that transcends anything I have ever felt before. I phoned the police and directed them to the remote location of this cavern. They didn't find any of the things I have described to them, not the twitching skins on the walls or anything, and they certainly found no trace of my cousin. I've since tortured myself by driving out to the location of the cavern and just standing nearby. If you've never experienced tragedy up close and personal like that before, then there's no point in trying to explain. It's like the way firefighters and soldiers will stand next to ground zero of the Twin Towers, even to this very day. It took me 3 years, but I finally saw something after all my pilgrimages to that cave. It was near sunset one evening when I saw a shape going towards the cavern at a fast clip. It looked every bit like my cousin. The resemblance struck me so hard that I forgot how to be afraid, and I chased after her in a state that felt somewhat like sleepwalking. I called out to her as I ran for all I was worth to catch her before she went inside. She stopped just long enough to look straight at me and then disappear inside. It was her. It looked just like her. The eyes were bigger and darker than I remembered, but I didn't care. I had found her. It had to be her. I gave in to my foolishness again and bounded after her into the darkness of this cavern. My phone lit the way, and I yelled for all I was worth. There were more skins than there had been 3 years prior. There was some that looked like hooded cloaks. I discovered to my horror that they were indeed human. The hoods were faces. They writhed and twitched in my presence. One of them, I swear, the empty face lifted and looked at me. Even though there were no eyes and no solid support, I recognized it right away. It was my cousin's skin. The mouth stretched and flexed and gaped, and a horrible wail sounded far off, as if her voice were coming from somewhere deep in the cave. I reported all this too. You can guess how they reacted, judging by how crazy and insane my story sounds. At the time, I was committed to an institution. The irony was that I needed the help after what I had seen. I can't talk about that experience with just anybody. There's too many people watching me to see if I might need to go back in for treatment. But the encounter is eating me alive, and I don't know why my cousin's skin is hanging on a cavern wall, and why it can scream. I don't know who is walking around with her appearance, and I don't know how long I could stay sane with the knowledge that something awful can happen to any person who ventures around here. My younger brother was really big on illegal hunting. He said that it was more fun when it was something you weren't supposed to be doing. Something about having something to hunt while watching out for being hunted by the law. Either way, he was a man prone to taking self-destructive chances. I went with him as an extra set of eyes. I'm sorry, but you just look out for your little bro. It's just the way it is. Plus, I didn't want him to pick a fight with any animal that's too big for him. He really was the stupid type. You know, the kind that would hit a bear with a stick, just for the thrill of being chased by it. I found out the hard way that you really can't save a man from his stupidity if he doesn't want to be saved. And I've paid with having to live with the memory of what happened. In a strange way, I resent my brother for having no such curse. We were in a West Virginia timber that was as wild as you can get, without it being too swampy. Life of all kinds was everywhere you looked. Of course, my stupid brother was there to shoot something. He wised up a little bit and took up bow hunting, something that requires far more skill than his dumb face could do. After telling him 500 times plus that loud noises draw the heat. He must have finally listened. He spotted an elk that he swore he couldn't do without. Even I had to admit that it was a very impressive animal. At the time, there wasn't a pass on hunting elk. The state was trying to build up their numbers. But this elk was a real looker, and I swear, the thing was looking directly into my brother's eyes. He thought so too, and there was no backing down for him. My brother threw all caution and stealth to the wind, sprinted after the elk, with bow in hand. The animal was very peculiar about my brother. It didn't run. It trotted away, but it made no effort to lose my brother. My brother moved faster than I thought he could ever move, so I had some catching up to do. He had gotten way ahead of me, and I wasn't a young man, not even then. I had to navigate a very steep hillside, full of young trees and saplings, which took me quite a while. My brother got through it like it was his element, which is why I was that much more surprised to see my brother standing at the top of a hill where it opened up into a flat, even glade, where one large tree dominated the center of the opening. I've seen some strange trees in those parts, but this one was like something from another world. The bark was black as tar, and it was bristling with spines long enough to be spears. When I caught up with my brother, he was standing in front of it, looking up into its wicked branches, and I noticed he wasn't holding his bow, and I was going to ask him what he did with it, when I noticed that one large spine impaled my brother through the mouth and erupted from the back of his skull. Somewhere in the fog of shock, I stumbled back just in time for a hunter's arrow to miss me by inches and strike a nearby tree. It was one of my brother's arrows. The bow was in the hands of something that had the elk's head, but everything from the neck down looked entirely human. At least mostly human. The exposed skin was a little too gray with hair, and looked a little coarse, even from the distance that I was. I tried to reconcile what I was seeing with the earlier sight of an actual elk running on four-hoofed legs. Now, there was this actor in a skin suit, and he really did wear a cape of skin. It was like a quilt of patchwork flesh. I think there was more than one animal in that cape too. But the arms and legs didn't quite look right to me. Or maybe the intensity of the moment distorted what I remember. I don't know. Either way, my brother died by his own weapon, shot by something that went from 4 legs to 2 in the blink of an eye. I don't know how that works, and you couldn't pay me enough to go back into that wild wood to find out. I learned that day, there are just some things that are meant to be left alone if you know what's good for you. In the meantime, I'm still deep in the process of mourning. Me and my brothers were deep in rural Nevada, and we were photographing everything. When I say we, I mean I. I was the shutterbug. That was back before digital was accessible. I lived for the experience of dropping my film off at Walmart and picking it up a few hours later. We were on the bus to our destination, and it had slowed so we could get a look at the open spaces around us. I saw something that couldn't have been 100% natural. It was a wolf, or a coyote, but appeared to have ruby red eyes, and what I swear had been short antlers of some kind. I didn't ask anybody else if they were seeing the same thing. I was too afraid that it would vanish if I looked away. This is usually the point where something goes wrong with the camera, but mine worked just fine. The animal even looked right at me as I fired off 15 shots. My last few shots coincided with the thing changing shape right in front of me and going from 4 legs to 2. Suddenly, I felt like I held $1 million in my camera. If those shots turned out good, I might be able to supply the world's first concrete evidence of something paranormal. However, the developed pictures came back and revealed nothing. The strange thing didn't even show up on film. Everything that had been around it was shown in crisp and sharp detail. Some of my best camera work, actually. Each one looked like well-composed nature shots. But the being, the subject in the photos, were missing entirely, as if they were 100% transparent and were gone, like they had never been there. I'm not quite sure how to explain it either. One of the most terrifying things that I've ever experienced happened just a few months ago. It is also something that I was never able to fully explain. I got a call from my mother to say that my grandma was feeling poorly, and I could run to the store to get her a few things, and then drop them over. My mother was out of town for a couple of days, and so I didn't really mind helping out. I headed straight to the deli and picked up the bits my mom had said to get, and a couple of treats for my grandma. Some of her favorite candy, and a couple of trashy magazines that she really liked reading. It didn't take too long, despite being fairly busy, and soon, I was heading out of the parking lot. It was this one-way system where you'd have to loop past the store to exit and get back onto the road. As I was driving past, I had to do a double take, because standing in front of the store, holding a bag of groceries, was Grandma, wearing her favorite purple leisure suit, and she smiled right at me. Now, the parking lot was backed up, so I couldn't slow down or block the road. I had no choice but to keep going. Although I thought it was very odd that she was at the store when my mother had asked me to go. At that point, I wasn't worried, nor scared. Just confused, I guess. I drive fairly quickly, and I was soon at her house. Her car was parked by the garage, which, again, I thought was kind of strange. She drives at the speed of an old lady. How on earth did she beat me back? My mom had always made sure that my sister and I had the key to their house, and this one, just in case we ever needed to get in. So, I unlocked the door now and called out. Nothing. I let myself in and dropped the keys and groceries on the table. Then, I heard a groan from upstairs. "Is that you?" my grandmother asked. I hurried up there to see her, and there, lying on the bed, in her purple leisure suit, was my grandmother, with one ankle raised up and the size of a Christmas ham. Turns out, she twisted it that morning, which was why she called my mother. She could only just hobble to the bathroom, let alone anything else. There was no way in hell she'd been at the grocery store. So I made her some tea and sat with her for a bit, listening to all the gossip from the neighborhood. I noticed that she had looked real tired too. I asked her if she'd been sleeping okay. It couldn't have been from the ankle pain, since that had just happened. She told me that not too well. Now I was feeling even more confused. See, my grandmother loves animals, but doesn't have any pets since they are a lot of commitment. And since my grandfather passed, she likes to be able to just up and visit family without having to worry too much on who's going to feed her cats. The dog that keeps coming into the yard, she kept talking about. Night after night it comes. I have no idea where it's from, she said, as she has never seen it around. She paused for another moment, trying to decide whether to carry on. I inquired her more and asked her what is it. She told me that this is going to sound silly, but last night she gave it a treat, and she had a funny feeling about it. This thing came right up close to her, and was a whole lot bigger than any other dog she'd ever seen, and then that she remembers distinctly that very moment that she had seen this thing's face, and it was very human-like and had very big yellow eyes. This wasn't a laughing matter, and she seemed genuinely frightened by the entire experience. So, for that, I'm not exactly sure. Although I never mentioned to her seeing her doppelganger at the store, from what she had just recounted, I had a nasty suspicion that she had encountered some sort of skinwalker or shapeshifter who had copied her image. Thankfully, she had never saw that dog again, and both her ankle and general health had recovered after a few days of rest. Why this just happened, I have no idea, but I really have no doubt about what it was. If you're curious, my grandmother doesn't exactly live in town. She doesn't really have much neighbors either. Her backyard is full of rolling pastures filled with thick timber, so she gets all sorts of wild animals. In fact, many times, she's told me that that's more than enough than having her own pet. A few years ago, a buddy of mine suggested we go on a road trip. It was the end of summer, before we headed back for our final years of college, and she wanted to do something fun and spontaneous. So, we threw some clothes in the bag, and off we went. We drove for a few miles, with no real clue where we headed, or even what we might do when we get there. But it didn't matter. This was freedom, and a spur-of-the-moment thing that we'd likely never get the chance again once we were headed off to law and medical school. After driving for around 12 hours straight, we found a motel and crashed for the night. Then, woke up and did it again. By this point, we were headed towards Nevada. We were having great fun, wind in our hair, tunes on the radio, and as it began to get late again, we looked out for somewhere to stay the night. Although we were mainly sticking to the highways, even some of the main routes now were kind of lonely, and we often didn't see another car for miles. We were also careful on the quieter roads to be on the lookout for any wildlife that might wander into the highway. The last thing we wanted was to run over a deer or a coyote. Not only would it likely damage the car, and make a hell of a mess when we were in the middle of nowhere. We were both animal lovers, and the thought of hurting something was abhorrent. So when I first saw the coyote or wolf, I wasn't sure which at first, as it was pretty dark. I was sure to mention it to Callie, who was driving at that point, to be aware of it, and that was all. It seemed to follow us along the road for a bit, as if playing a sick game of chase, but I did think it was kinda cute. I wasn't sure how it was keeping pace, but we weren't going too fast. I suggested that it might have a lot of stamina. Callie began to feel slightly ill and at ease, so she put her foot on the gas to speed up ever so slightly. She was more inclined to acknowledge whether it was a wolf, coyote, or some kind of wild rabid dog. It was a predator, and it was best if we lost it. but we didn't. Callie sped up, and it did too. "What the hell?" she had asked, ramming her foot onto the gas pedal and taking the speedometer up to 70 miles an hour. And it kept the pace, as if we were at a calm walking speed. We were freaking out. There was no way this animal should be able to do this. It was near impossible. I watched the speedometer climb up to 90 and even up to 100 miles an hour, and Callie looking as if she was losing control. And when I dared to glance out the window, it was still there, its face turned towards us. It was huge, much bigger than what I would presume your average canine desert beast would average, and it had bright yellow eyes. They glowed like orbs. I held in a scream, and to this day, I don't know how I managed. I just knew at this speed, I couldn't startle Callie, or we'd wind up in a ditch. Then, all of a sudden, it was gone. She brought the car back down to around 70, and maintained that all the way to the stretch of lights and buildings that also included a Motel 6. We were both absolutely terrified, and it took us some time to be brave enough to leave the car and race over to the motel. Sensing our distress, the guy behind the check-in desk asked if we were okay. Did we need any help? When we told him what had happened, he just nodded and suggested that we find a different route home. Looking at each other, we knew there was no way in hell we'd ever drive that stretch of highway again. Back in high school, I had a really good friend who lived on the res. His folks owned a farm out there, and sometimes I would stay over and help out with chores. I really liked animals, and had wondered about maybe becoming a veterinarian someday. Since the property was surrounded by thick woodland, and their cattle was their livelihood, they had plenty of fencing and traps laid out for any would-be predators, such as coyotes or wolves, something that might try and attack and hurt the herd. One of the neighbors had to have been on the lookout for some sort of mangy-looking coyote, who was obviously getting braver the hungrier it got, as it had been seen straying closer to the properties. I kind of felt a little sorry for it, not liking to think that any creature should be starving, even one that was likely to cause devastation if it was to get into the field. There was also the matter that several of the cows with calf, which made them slower as they were huge, therefore easier prey, and the fact that the family would be losing 2 creatures. So, all this meant they were being extra vigilant and on hyper alert for any evidence that the coyote was planning an attack. Which leads me to the reason that my friend and I were in the field that evening, complete with shotguns, hiding and waiting for the beast to appear. We planned to stay out there for a few hours, probably until we got too cold and earned some brownie points from his mom. It was just after midnight, getting close to when we would call it a day, when we heard a noise. George's dad had installed security lights, and although it was not exactly lit up like Friday night on a football field, it still gave us an advantage. So, when we saw what we thought was a coyote, George got his trigger finger ready on the shotgun. "Move back," he whispered to me as he aimed at this thing. He fired one shot. The cows started mooing and shuffling about as we craned our necks to see if we'd hit the thing. And that's when, to our horror, this thing stood up on 2 legs, just like a freaking person, and ran off. Although it was much taller than a coyote, which would normally stand on 2 legs. Way, way taller than any dog would ever be able to be. We could see from the illumination from the security lights that this thing was covered in reddish hair, and quick as a flash, it ran. George, seemingly unturned by this development, ran to the perimeter and fired off several more shots. I have no idea if he hit anything. He came back to me, then said we needed to get inside very fast. Waking up his parents, he asked if I wouldn't mind waiting in the kitchen for a moment whilst he talked to them. I wasn't sure what to think. Had I really just seen a huge red coyote person thing standing on 2 feet and then disappearing at the speed of light? When George came back into the kitchen, he looked frightened. He told me that he wasn't allowed to fill me in on much of it because it was against tribal lore to share such things with outsiders, no matter how close I was to him and the family. I understood, as his traditions are sacred. All he was able to say was that I wasn't to come back until the place was safe. The creature we had seen was far more powerful and evil than I could ever imagine. I didn't ask any more, but when I got home, you bet I went and searched online. I looked and looked, and the only thing I could find was that of a skinwalker. Is this exactly what we encountered? Or could we have encountered something more demonic? First off, I'm not a professional and not exactly sure if these are skinwalkers. It was 2019, November I believe. I went hunting with my family, and we own a huge farm. I would love to share where, but have been stalked before, and that's still a fear of mine. Anyway, we set out around 5 in the morning, but that's not important. Later that day, finally, my cousin had shot one, a medium-sized buck, a 4-pointer. It was growing dark as we got the buck into the garage to prepare. Anyway, as we were skinning the deer, the forest grew eerily silent. The only sound was light footsteps in the forest and coyotes howling off in the distance. By the time we finished skinning the deer, it was now pitch black. Just as we were about to leave the garage and go eat dinner, the door got stuck. My uncle was relatively mad and fought with it. He couldn't get the garage door all the way closed, but gave up. So we go eat, and then off to bed. I couldn't sleep. Something kept me up. I had the best bed, warm temperatures. Everything was perfect, but I just couldn't sleep. My window was opened, and I was hearing crunches outside. Now, keep in mind, this is about 1 in the morning. I tossed and turned, but nothing. Then the tapping and scratching started on my window screen. I was horrified. I grabbed my phone and shined the flashlight over to the screen. What I saw horrified me. It was the deer we had just skinned earlier. Not I forgot to mention, but this deer had a huge dent in its skull. We had no idea why, but on this imposter, the same dent was in the same place. I was slightly alarmed at the sight, and then I remembered. My window is 6 feet off the ground. I sat there, frozen in fear, and the thing let out a low growl and stared at me. I tried to ignore it, but fear overwhelmed me, and I then fainted. I woke up in the morning and ran over to the garage. The skin was gone. The only thing left was a pool of blood. The deer was still hanging up fine. I ran over to my window, and there were prints. Not deer prints. They looked like footprints, mixed with a deer hoof, and some type of deep indentation that could have been a claw mark. I grew up going to my non-blood related, very close family's friend, uncle's cabin, which was on a lake connecting to many other lakes, which goes into a well-known chain of lakes in that region. Anyway, this was when I was about 9 years old, and I had an extreme fear of being anywhere without my mother, since she was the only one around to take care of me and my siblings. This is because my dad had always been a heavy drinker and on deployment, but luckily not abusive. So, because of this, I was sleeping in the same bed as my mom on the ground floor of the old early 19th century cabin. It was raining outside, and around 1 a.m., I could not fall asleep for some reason. The window on the left of the bed was open with a screen on, and my mother was fast asleep. I looked out the window to look at all the trees outside when I heard it. It sounded like the noise of a cliché monster would make, except this was booming across the entire lake outside the cabin, and since I'd been looking at the trees, I could see the trunks and branches vibrating from the roar that I had heard. Since it was so loud, I had no idea which way it came from, but I knew that I had heard it. When it was only me and my uncle and older brother. This time, I was 12. I told my uncle all about it, and he started freaking out. He had told me that the Native American artifacts and items had been constantly found around that area since long before it became a settled town. Ever since then, I've been able to notice strange things in the surrounding woods and lakes, especially while kayak fishing on my own during the dusk. Just small things, like an animal staring at me through the edge of the woods for at least 30 minutes at a time, and following me when I got to a new spot. On one occasion, I was going swimming out in the middle of the lake. I'd gotten there by my uncle's jet ski, so from far away, it would be semi-hard to spot me. I had been swimming around for 25 minutes when I noticed a man's head bobbing up and down in the water, all while staring at me. He had not been there before, and I hadn't or heard him seen him swim out there. Keep in mind, this is about a half mile from the nearest shore. Needless to say, I got the hell home after watching him for just a couple of minutes, just sitting there. My last experience that I will share was again when I was around 12. I was wakeboarding, which, by the way, is my favorite water sport. It was a gloomy day, so that could have very well contributed to this feeling. But every time I let go of the rope and waited for my uncle to turn around and come get me in that boat, I got the most strong feeling of being watched, more than I ever have in my entire life. I felt it all around me, from the trees, the murky black ice like water surrounding me, and the dark, looming sky. I felt like I was going to be swallowed by the eeriness, to the point that I almost began vomiting. The dark water was so cold, I couldn't even feel my legs. When I got back on the boat, I was shivering, and my uncle had thought the water was really cold, so he stuck his foot in. The water was warm, almost too warm to swim in. I felt the water, and it was warm, which was very different from the water I felt before. The clouds began to clear, and the forest around me began to look normal and warm. I don't usually go swimming anymore, or go out alone in the lake to fish by myself. So, long story short, My girlfriend and I were swapping scary stories, and she told me about skinwalkers, which I'd never heard of before. When she told me what they were and showed me a few videos, I immediately thought of an experience that I had right about 8 years ago when I was just 15 and my brother was 12. We grew up in rural northwestern Missouri, a little over an hour and a half north of Kansas City. We had 2 other houses on our road, both about a mile away, but they were both quiet, elderly couples who I've never seen out past dark. All of the houses on our road, mine included, were surrounded by corn and wheat fields and trees on all sides. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the most awful, blood-curdling scream outside my window. It sounded like a woman being brutally murdered in the road. Her scream was so garbled and desperate. I'm 5'3" and was a 15-year-old girl. So, obviously, I ran to my parents' room to tell my dad she needed help. They said they hadn't heard anything outside, which blew my mind, because it was so loud that it made my very blood run cold. Not 5 seconds later, my brother came running in, saying he was in his room and heard a woman screaming for help outside. At this point, my dad started to get concerned and ran outside. But there was nobody else around. I could usually see headlights through my bedroom window, so we were pretty sure no cars had gone by. There was no way she could have disappeared so quickly, especially judging by her screams. My mom, dad, and little sister, who was 8 years old at the time, never heard a sound, but my brother and I still occasionally talk about it to this day, just because it was so weird and upsetting. My mom swears it was an owl, but I'd heard screeching owls a handful of times while living there, and it was most definitely not an owl. I've been told that mountain lions sometimes make a noise like a woman's scream, but they're incredibly rare in that part of Missouri. Even growing up in the country with a forest behind my house, I'd only seen a mountain lion once in the entire 10 years I lived there. My mom has seen one, once, also in that same time frame, but we've never heard them. So, I guess it could have been a mountain lion, but I still don't think that's what I heard. Just a woman's scream that was way too loud, and had something a little off about it. I appreciate any answers anybody might be able to give me. It was a crazy experience, and now that I look back on it, it's spooky, and it rendered me unable to sleep. Hello, what lurks beneath. I came across your channel recently as I was surfing around looking for an explanation for an experience I had rather recently, which I believe to have been a skinwalker. I am not at all somebody who is immersed in ghost stories or even taking any interest in supernatural encounters, but this was an experience that has left a mark on me and has confirmed my previously speculative belief in other beings. I'm a waitress from Chicago, and one evening I was finishing my shift. It was long, very, very long, and I was tired. I do confess that I enjoy a cigarette after my shift, and I usually have this with another waiter, Mario, out of the back alleyway where we keep our food bins. Myself and Mario were standing there, chatting and talking about our plans for the weekend, when we heard a groan from behind one of the dumpsters. We both kind of jumped, but then we knew that the alleyway behind the restaurant where we go is often visited by local kids, and we just assumed they were goofing off. I was facing Mario, and he was facing the dumpsters, and we continued conversing and laughing about anything and everything. We both got along so well, and lately there had seemed to be a bit of a spark between us. We heard the grunt again, and this time, Mario yells over, "Hey, knock it off." And we expected to hear laughing and kids running away, but we didn't. Just silence. Mario shrugged it, and I felt a little weird and worried, but at the same time, I really wanted to kiss him, and I didn't want some dumb kids ruining the moment. Of course, it wasn't very romantic in an alleyway, but I had such a long day, and the manager had been totally mean to me. I needed some TLC, and this darn grunting was a pain in my neck. We heard it for the third time, and this time I snapped. "Guys, stop goofing around, or we're calling the cops." I walked over to the dumpster where I could see the alleyway behind, and to my surprise, there was no one there. It was perfectly still and secluded. The only sign of any life was a shrub, which was swaying slightly in the light night breeze. I began to think maybe it was a cat, but I had never heard of such a sound from a cat before. The whole thing was a bit spooky. We both checked our phones to ensure we hadn't seen some strange ringtone, which was playing tricks on us. Our phones were both off, so it had to have been something behind the dumpster. We both finished our cigarettes and resumed our position of me with my back to the dumpster. I began giving Mario the eye, batting my eyelashes, trying to act cute. Maybe, if I was lucky, he would kiss me. I continued watching him and realized his face had gone white as a sheet. Mario's mouth was open, in an expression of absolute horror, terror, and bewilderment. His eyes scrunched up, as if he was seeing something terrible. I turned around and immediately grabbed a hold of his arm, as I witnessed the being he had spotted. Before us, behind the dumpsters, was a man, or it looked like a man, that had to have been around 8 to 9 feet tall. This thing towered over me and Mario, but this was not any man. That was a beast. His, or her, or its body was covered in brown fur, with what looked to be white patches. His feet were stuck together, forming a solid block of marble, and its eyes were like red slits. It also had a kind of antler-like thing coming out of its forehead. I did not know what I was saying, but I immediately made an active confession as I prepared to die. I felt this beast was so monstrous that it would surely annihilate me and Mario on the spot. Whatever it was came from the pits of hell. The creature continued to stare at us with eyes filled with menace and curiosity, as if taking in these strange creatures before it. Us. We both just stood there, holding each other and shaking. I could feel this man's whimpers and moans, as if he had become a 5-year-old kid again, scared of the boogeyman. But this was a boogeyman. This was literally a beast from the pits of hell. This creature raised its hand and gestured them towards us. Its arms were now reaching out before us, and white sparks seemed to emanate from its fingertips and bolted to the sky, and seemed to almost circle over us. Mario began screaming in terror, and I fell to the ground, surrendering myself to the monster, as this was becoming unbearable. Mario's screaming stopped, and I opened my eyes, and the creature was nowhere to be found. We both continued sobbing and hugging each other for another 20 minutes before we garnished the strength to walk back into our shift. I have felt extremely emotionally unwell and fragile since this whole experience, and have not been able to eat much or sleep. I keep having frequent nightmares and have had flashbacks, which have literally made me break out in pools of cold sweat. I feel as if something is watching me, and I don't know what or how to shake this feeling off. I don't know if that creature did something to me or what happened, but I have felt violated on an emotional level since then. Mario has been off work too. He put it down as stress and anxiety, and I have no doubt that he too is experiencing total terror. I have only spoken to him once, but he kept his distance from me, as if I have somehow been responsible for the terrible sights we saw. It's, well, been only a few weeks since this event, and I need answers and a sense of healing with conclusions. I can't live like this, and I'm thinking about seeking professional help. Can you look into this and see if this was a skinwalker, or have there been any other similar sightings in my area? Hi, my name is Larry, or for the sake of this story, I'll call myself Larry. I'm a 35-year-old accountant based in London, England. I'm writing in as I have recently been undergoing some mental health counseling, and I have an exercise in which I have to try and heal particularly traumatic incidents. When I was 17, I believe I encountered a skinwalker. I know it sounds insane, but please, bear with me. Listen to my story. I consider myself a kind and considerate person now, but when I was a teenager, I won't lie, I was kind of an a-hole. I bullied weaker kids, kids with issues, kids from bad homes. Basically, anyone who I felt was below me, I made them feel even worse. I guess I just felt bad about myself and felt the need to embellish myself by putting others down. I feel bad about it now, and I've done a lot of work on healing the past. But one incident still haunts me to this day. So, in math class, the teacher had fallen asleep at his desk, and I decided to have some fun. I put on the teacher's glasses and began writing stuff on the blackboard. All the things I wrote were insults about the kids in the class. A few examples would be Larry Lisp Rafferty, or Michael No Mates because your mom's fat. It was pretty mean, but my friends in the class laughed and made me feel like I was a hero. The thing about it was, I never picked on anybody who I knew would stand up for themselves. I was always careful to target somebody who had low confidence and couldn't defend themselves. I guess anyone who reads this story won't have much sympathy for me, but all I can do is articulate that I am remorseful for how I treated people during my school years. Hurting people hurt people. And I guess I channeled my own self-hatred through my persecution of weaker individuals. On this occasion, in the same class, there was a class sitting at the back with long black hair. She was a pretty goth-looking girl, nose ring and all, dark eye makeup, and pale foundation to make her already look like ghostly white. She wore her hair down to her waist, and she had large glasses. She wore a dark blouse and deep purple jackets with black and purple striped stockings. She was actually quite pretty, but clearly wanted to hide her appearance away behind all the goth makeup. For the sake of the story, we'll call her Louise, but everybody called her Loser. There was a rumor going around the school that her father had been sent to prison for abusing her, and that's why she was so messed up. Her calmness and lack of interest in my bravado infuriated me. She was just sitting back there, looking out the window with her icy blue eyes. It sickened me. I wanted to make her recognize me and my power. So I shouted to her, "Why don't you come up and teach us math? You seem to teach your dad a few tricks." She continued staring out the window, and some of my friends laughed but looked pretty sheepish. I had clearly taken it too far. A single tear came down her cheek, and it was such a fragile event. I felt like someone had kicked me in the stomach. I went back to the front and picked on another kid. As I was walking home that evening, I wasn't too far from my house. I saw a dumpster in an alleyway, which was shaking. I wondered what the hell it was, but decided to just walk past it. a further bit along my path, I noticed a work van parked on the footpath. Its windows were all misty, and there was a screaming coming from within the van. It definitely wasn't lovemaking, but sounded like raccoons or some type of animal. At this point, I got a bit weirded out. For some reason, I had the urge to turn around, and when I did, I could see a figure about 10 feet behind me. It was Luis, but was not the Luis from class. This figure, this creature had the facial features of Luis, but was over 7 feet tall, with eyes which seemed to emanate red, and they were striking my heart through an intense stare. Although no pain, it was total fear that I felt. Her hands seemed to be covered in a matted black fur, and thighs that had expanded to look like thick tree trunks of hunk and muscle, like a damn dinosaur. The expression from this being was of an absolute fury, and I truly believed that I was going to die. I screamed at this thing to leave me alone. As I shouted, I fell to the ground and attempted to crawl backwards. This creature's arm extended out, and it raised its hands high up. At that moment, a large amount of static electricity and lightning began shocking through the sky. I began to cry and managed to get up and run back home. When I got home, I locked myself in my room and prayed for forgiveness. I knew I had somehow angered God or the universe by my humiliation. The next day, the person who was Luis, or whatever, was gone. Rumor had it that she had left school and moved back with her birth mother to Scotland. I didn't tell a soul about my experience. Years later and now, I wonder if Luis may have been a skinwalker, I guess you would call it. It would certainly make sense from my knowledge. If you can assist me in any way, that would be great. I know very little of skinwalkers. I know they're supposed to be of American native lore and legend, but I've also heard they are also shapeshifters, which, again, I don't know anything about. But anyway, this story is real, and I'm still dealing with the trauma of it. Please, help me. I've never really been one to buy into the whole skinwalker nonsense that's talked about frequently in the Navajo culture, as well as just hearing it in the general southern United States area. But I have something that genuinely happened to me that's really left me terrified. Let me explain this to you. I was driving in the later evening in southern Arizona, far away from any Indian reservation to my knowledge. This is one of the things that is a red flag in my head, because it just doesn't make any sense. I guess I realize that they're everywhere in this region and don't pertain to one specific reservation. So, I'm driving, and there's no other cars on the road at this time. It's getting pretty dusk, so the sun is setting. By the way, if you have ever been in Arizona during a sunset, it is absolutely gorgeous. Just saying. That's really the only positive side note to this entire story. I'm coming up to a bend in the road, or should I say a bend in the hill, when I go up it and over, and blocking the road up ahead is probably what I can make out to be around 6 or 7 coyotes, just sitting there in the middle of the road, facing my oncoming vehicle. What the hell? I whispered to myself. Why are there these coyotes sitting there in the middle of the road, blocking it? But as I pull closer, I realize something is horribly wrong. Not only are these coyotes much larger in size than your average coyote, but they all looked terrible. They were disfigured, emaciated. They looked like they had a terrible case of mange, and they all looked deformed. Before I even came to a stop, I got a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach, and I felt like I needed to turn around and leave in that instant. There is nobody else on this road, so of course all 6 or 7 of these things turn around and their attention towards me. That's what I noticed something even more unnerving. All of them have solid white eyes. No iris, no pupils, nothing. There was nothing animalistic about them, and that feeling in the pit of my stomach grew worse and worse each second that I sat in this situation. I hadn't even fully stopped the vehicle before I quickly swerved the vehicle in a 180 fashion and hauled out of there. I can't say for certain that this was a pack of skinwalkers, but I just find it very weird that you have a pack of 7 of them, all looking deformed and covered in mange and emaciated looking. Gosh, they looked so grotesque, and in a small group like that, there's no explaining it. When I pulled up to them, they all had their heads down, but still facing in my direction. And like I said, they all turned up to face me in unison. The way they turned their heads to look at me right in the face was just beyond creepy. They weren't even looking at my car though, and even though I had my headlights on, they were looking right through my windshield, directly at my face. I could feel it. I sensed they were looking into my soul. Man, did that not give me the heebie-jeebies. And even as I type this out, it's making me relive that horrible memory. Now, I get freaked out every time I'm driving down there, which I still do frequently because I have many family and friends that live in the area. I've heard all sorts of weird stuff that goes on in the desert, like UFOs, alien abductions, weird stuff like that, but I never in my life would have imagined skinwalkers trying to stop me in the middle of the road. Like I said, it may have just been a coincidence, but I don't think I would have got that feeling in my gut had it just been a pack of regular coyotes. There was just something so off about all of it. I trust my gut instinct when it tells me there's something wrong. And boy, my entire body was just screaming at me to get out of there. Anyway, I hope this email isn't too long for you to read, but I just wanted to share with you my skinwalker experience, or what I believe to be a skinwalker experience. Stay out of Arizona if you can. It's not meant for people like us. So, a couple of my family friends have some Navajo in them. I'll call her Sarah for the sake of her identity being shared. Sarah is a close friend of mine and is fully Caucasian. Her husband, whom I'll call Mark, is full-blooded Navajo. We live up here in the Pacific Northwest, and his parents are from the reservation. They came up here when he was much younger, and he pretty much grew up here with them, and they eventually moved back to the res full-time. He was old enough that he decided to stay up here and start his life while they still lived and moved back down there. Every once in a while, Sarah and Mark still go down there and visit his family, who again are full-blooded Navajo. Mind you, they are very enriched in their culture and very religious in their Navajo traditions. Sarah has had plenty of skinwalker stories, and she even recites them by their actual name, which I will not repeat for the sake of my own protection. Silly or not, I don't care what anybody thinks after the story Sarah told me. I don't want to be at the mercy of these things. Even though she has shared with me several, I'll recount to you one that really sticks out to me. Sarah and Mark had gone down for a week to go visit his family, and if you didn't know, there's virtually zero cell service down there in that reservation. In fact, I think there's a special cell phone service that's meant just for the res. I digress. So, she's down there at night, smoking a cigarette, and her whole family is telling her that's a bad idea. If you throw the butt of the cigarette down, these things will come. I can't remember off the top of my head what Sarah did, but she attracted one of these things, because later on, when she went to bed, it came. It came up to the house, and she said that you could feel its energy approaching. She told me it was the most eerie, scary sensation she has ever felt. And this is a girl who grew up in a house filled with poltergeist. She said she fell into a sleep-like state, or trance, have you, and had horrible nightmares that this black, smoky vapor shape flew into her bedroom through the window and clung to her ceiling and took shape of a demon and terrorized her for the entire night. The very next morning, all of Mark's family was doing rituals and prayer to ward off this skinwalker that she had invited to come to the house, even though it was an accident. They take these situations very seriously because to them, a skinwalker isn't just some mysterious cryptid creature that walks up and terrorizes a random family. These things will hunt family members down and cause ill luck and misfortune to happen, even as far as casting spells on good people, making them sick and ruining their lives. They are dangerous beings of darkness. Sarah told me it's true. They are crawling all over the res, and you just have to be aware of the things you do and say to not draw them near. It's also very common for people just coming out of the reservation that are not familiar with tradition to accidentally attract these creatures and to bring bad luck and misfortune upon themselves in the process. So, I want to start off this email by saying that I'm not too familiar with really any of the areas in New Mexico, so I can't fully recall exactly where I was. At the time, I drove a 1998 Honda Civic. It was a piece of crap. And of course, out of all the times it decided to poop out was when I was on this smaller road. And it was while I was driving semi-cross country. It was a hot day, so first the AC went out, then the car went out, and here I am, stuck in the New Mexico desert, and I have to walk my happy ass through a very small stretch of desert because the road I was on was leaving in the total opposite direction. Luckily for me though, I still had signal, and my GPS worked, so I figured I would just walk through a few miles through the small sections of desert to go run to the needed area to get help. Here's where things get weird. Off to my left was a small bluff that I did not notice right away, or at least noticed what was on it. I began to feel like I was being watched and got a really uncomfortable feeling. I shake it off at first, thinking the heat in the sun is probably just getting to me because I'm not used to this kind of heat. I'm looking around and I happen to turn and notice this dark figure watching me from on top of this smaller bluff. I'm not terribly far away from it, so I can make out some details, although they are minor. It looked like a very slim, slender thing. A being in black, torn, tattered robes from what I can describe. Whoever or whatever it was had a large animal skull on top of their head, with horns. They were covered from head to toe in this black, dirty, tattered robe, so I couldn't exactly see who it was or what was watching me. But when I mean they were slender, I mean like really slender, stick thin. I'm talking Ethiopian starving and haven't eaten in 3 weeks slender. It was unnatural, and it really gave me the creeps. So I kept on walking, but this person thing just kept watching me the entire time. I would be periodically checking over my shoulder to see if this freak was watching me, and at one point or another, it was gone. This made me feel even more nervous now, like this person was going to pursue me and chase me, so I quickly tried to pick up my pace and double time it. I don't know who this was, or what their intentions were, or why they were watching me so closely, but I was not comfortable being their Truman Show entertainment. The only thing I really know about the desert is that there's Las Vegas and of course Area 51, where all sorts of creepy, freaky stuff happens. Oh, I forgot about the Roswell crash. In fact, I don't even think I was more than 50 to 100 miles away from that area, if I'm not mistaken. Either way, screw what happened here. I didn't want any part to play. I eventually made it the 4-mile trek, and made it to where I needed to go get help for my Honda Civic. But that was probably one of the creepiest times I can ever recall happening in my life. There is an upside though. I'm very thankful that this happened to me at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. I can't imagine, nor do I even want to think about it, had this happened to me if it was after 10, or at night when it's totally pitch black outside. I think I probably just would have called for somebody to pick me up, or waited for hours or something for an Uber. I'm never walking through the desert at night, let alone during the day anymore. Especially after something like this is happening. You can count me out. About 20 years ago now, I dated an Inuit girl who was living in Washington, D.C. I had just graduated college with a bachelor's in anthropology, so
I was absolutely fascinated with her stories of her childhood in Alaska. Anyway, one night over drinks, the conversation moves to skinwalkers. I had never heard of them, so of course I wanted to know more. I never thought of her as a superstitious person, but this topic was clearly unsettling to her. Basically, she was of the mind that she wasn't sure if she believed in them, but they played such a prominent role in her cultural upbringing and were so terrifying that, real or not, it was better to not dig too far into them. A few days later, we were in the DuPont Circle, or the DC, when the topic pops into my head again. We were on our way to get lunch, and I brought it up. She got pretty mad and said that it was stupid to talk about them, and when there were so many people around, because there could be one nearby. I laughed and played it off, when all of a sudden, this guy across the street, facing away from me, stopped and stared directly at me. I felt terror to my core, and I can't explain it, but my urge to get away was overwhelming. There was no possible way for him to have heard me, but his gaze did not waver. He was absolutely looking at me. Even as I'm writing this, I'm getting chills. I genuinely am pretty skeptical and try to find a logical explanation to things, but whatever that was scares me to this day. I'm Rick Martinez, a truck driver, coming back up from Utah, going into Nevada. I pulled over to update my logs and got up on top of a hill to a rest area. Nothing but desert all around me. No cars, no nothing. As I was writing into my logbook, I felt like somebody was staring at me. So I looked up and saw this old man standing there, all raggedy, with a long beard, just staring at me. So I rolled down my window and asked him, "Are you okay?" And he would not answer. So I repeated, "Are you alright? Do you need help? Do you want some water?" He still would not answer me. So I opened the door and stood on my step and said, "I'm not coming down. You need to come over here." He wouldn't answer. So I told him, "Okay, old man, last chance. If you need help, tell me now." So I got back in my truck, closed the door, put my truck in gear, and started to roll off. He started to walk alongside the truck. I'm thinking I'm gonna end up running this guy over, so I just said, "Let me get out of here." As I pick up speed, he starts running alongside of the truck. And I'm thinking this is freaking crazy. This old guy is out of his mind. I began picking up more speed, getting ready to get back on the highway, and I turned to look to make sure I'm not gonna run this old guy over. And he's not there. What I see instead is a coyote running next to me, and that coyote kept up with the truck for at least a couple of blocks, until finally I started pulling away from him. I didn't want to look in the rearview mirror anymore. I just wanted to get away. This was midwinter, so about early January, and my cousin and I were out in the woods playing. Mind you, we were 6 and 7 at the time, and we stumbled upon a carcass. Now, this carcass was of a robin bird, freshly killed, but the way it was killed was unlike anything neither him or I had ever seen before. Up until this point, I had been hunting with my dad every year since I was about 4, and I had seen dead birds and eaten carcasses before. It was torn in two, one half not too far away from the other, and its entrails had been eaten, but not anything else on it like anything conventional. Now we get back to playing, and notice other oddities in the small patch of woods we were in. The hill next to his barn was steep and snow-covered, but every so often there were patches of bird feathers, almost ritualistically plotted all around to mark something, a territorial boundary, I'd presume. But anyway, further down the small trail that led to the road uphill, we seen it. It was a humanoid. Thin, brown, hairless, and soulless. It had deep, dark pools for eyes like craters in its face, and was built so wrong. Its arms were ungodly long and slim to a point where you could see bone. Now at this point, the tough guy in me and my cousin thought we were going to begin to yell and throw our hands as we charged it. It was gone in a matter of seconds, bolting in the tree line, into the road, and gone the other side. After this, my cousin and I ran inside, almost began to cry, questioning on what we had just experienced. The story, however, does not end there. Fast forward to 2016. My cousin is in the living room, and he's watching TV. The dog had to go out for a dump or something, so he let it out and watched her. That's when this thing makes itself known. In the tree line, it leers up and looks dead at him. But when it noticed the rushing dog coming at it, barking like hell, it hunched over and froze. The dog stopped suddenly right in front of it and began to sniff, clearly confused. Soon enough, the dog walked away, crapped, and was let back inside. This thing glanced at my cousin one more time and walked off. It's 2020 now, and my cousin had only one more experience like this since, and that was when he was with his girlfriend. They were ready to get down and dirty with it by his car in a bigger patch of secluded woods by his house when he heard this noise, similar to a bear, but with a more human tone to it. After hearing this, they hauled butt back to his car, and ever since then, he refused to go back. After having an in-depth conversation with him, recollecting all of this information, we agreed to try and hunt a skinwalker, or a wendigo, or something like that. Take my story as you will, but I just want to ask you, what the hell did he see? What the hell stalks the rural woods of New Hampshire to such an extent? Mind you, when I seen this thing, it was about the size of myself, a 7-year-old. When my cousin seen it, he said it was much larger, yet retained the hairless and skinny physique. Should we hunt and try to kill it, or leave it be? Whatever it was intelligent, ritualistic, and cunning. I'm just curious to find out if it was a skinwalker or not, and take my word for it, because I do believe most of these things hunt and stalk the rural areas of the North American wilderness. My cousin once told me about a time he and a friend heard what he honestly thinks was a skinwalker. I believe they may have also had a glimpse on a creature, but I'm not sure. Now, my cousin is a big guy. He's not scared easily, and this time, he was truly scared, which is concerning. Anyway, he and his buddy were camping and went for a bike ride. They heard something in front and heard noises, and then they backed away and heard it run around and get in front of them, or close to it. So they both gunned it, hearing the creature following them. My cousin says the creature sounded like it was made of sticks, and I believe he saw something though. He didn't describe the thing to me. There was another time that him and a different friend heard a large creature walk past them at night. The creature, they say, was massive and made strange noises. They also said they heard birds chirping around it, but it sounded fake. The birds, I mean. The area they were in was basically a massive hill, and it was all downhill, which was basically a 90-degree drop, meaning it had to be massive for them to hear it that close. This was 7 months ago, but I still haven't gotten any answers from anybody, so I'll share it and see what you guys think. So I just got back from my walk. It's about 7 p.m. for me. The sun was setting, and it's already overcast, so it's a bit darker than usual. And for a little background, I live in Phoenix, Arizona. One of those houses, kind of away from the main city. Out right by a mountain preserve, I guess you could say. It's basically connected to it. A very cool area, but very unsettling at night. That's where I go on my walks. About 15 minutes away from the house, right in front of me, I see this strange looking creature about 10 feet away from me, seem to be floating, completely motionless and hard to make out exactly what it looked like, but it appeared to have glowing red eyes, one snapped horn and another full horn on its head, long black demonic arms with sharp-looking claws, wearing a dark black, raggedy cloak. I looked at it for about 2 whole seconds before it vanished, almost like fog. Then it appeared again further down my walk, about 5 to 6 minutes later, even further than before, almost like it was watching me from a distance. I was listening to my playlist at the time, and suddenly, a loud, I mean loud, horrible high-pitched blood-curdling scream blasted through my headphones in the middle of the song, and the creature vanished. It was the loudest scream that I've ever heard, but it was probably because it was directly into my ears, but still, it made me drop to my knees. After that, it seemed to vanish. I didn't see it again, but the rest of the way home, I felt a presence, as well as being watched. I've had lots of encounters with other creatures, but this one was probably the most terrifying I've had. I've speculated it being a skinwalker, or even a banshee, but would definitely like to hear other opinions.